Welcome to Planted, finding your roots in STEM careers. Journey with us as we navigate the winding path into plant-related careers with professionals who have taken root or are still branching out. I'm Megan Wiesbrook.
And I'm Jessica Turner-Scoff.
In this season of Planted, we are exploring the fields of opportunity that are associated with plant-focused STEM careers. That's right, all the cool industries and places that you can work with plants.
And not every job or career fits in a single box or a single industry. Sometimes it can span multiple industries. So today, we are going to be discussing bridging industries, or what happens when research meets plant production, meets horticulture, meets museums.
That's right. We are thrilled to be able to introduce our very own Kim Shearer, the Morton Arboretum's tree and shrub breeder. Thank you so much for being a guest on Planted.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, listeners of Planted will know we like to take three things that seemingly do not seem to be related at all and have our guests tell the story of how they connect the dots. So, Kim, how do quilting, army brats, and magnolias relate to you?
Well, so I'm an army brat. My father was in the military when I was growing up. We lived all over the place. And his mother, my grandmother, was an excellent quilter. So she taught me how to quilt. And I would say, was it 2018 maybe? It's hard to remember these days after the pandemic. I made a magnolia quilt. It's a wall hanging for an organization called the Magnolia Society International, which is basically a club for people who are just crazy about magnolias. And so that was a donation for their silent auction.
Would we be able to see a photo of that?
Yeah, if you would like to check out my Instagram profile.
We will include that.
And we'll be sure to include that in the bonus content too. Because that sounds, I'm envisioning it and I'm sure I am getting it way wrong on how intricate it is because magnolias are such cool flowers. And you put that in quilt form and it's
so interesting.
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, I didn't actually design the quilt, as a pattern.
But you made it. But you made it. That counts.
That counts. We are so excited to have you as a guest. Your job is super unique. It's super important. And so we're just excited to talk to you this afternoon. So let's get into it.
All right.
Your job spans multiple industries, as we said. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is like to be a plant breeder at the Morton Arboretum? And what is it like to connect industry, research, and the nonprofit world?
What's it like to be a plant breeder at the Arboretum? It's a little bit overwhelming, to be honest. We have about 1,700 acres, a little bit more than that at the Arboretum. And that is essentially like a breeder's playground, right? Mm-hmm. So all of those plants are, for the most part, free game for me to use as tools in my breeding program. But, I'm fortunate because I get to work with this really generous nursery industry, which is a network that is national and sometimes international. And I also get to work with other researchers at universities around the country who are doing the same type of work I'm doing. And with the USDA. So, I get to connect all those people together or those networks together to actually bring new plants to the American landscape, whether they're plants that I eventually develop through my breeding or they're plants from someone else's breeding work at the Morton Arboretum.
Well, it sounds like a really unique opportunity to kind of work with a lot of different industries, a lot of different groups of people. But I'd love to hear about your background into your career path. Like can you talk us through that journey of how you found your way into this super unique and super nuanced field?
Well, it wasn't really like a direct path. It was pretty circuitous,
Yeah.
So I took about 10 years off of school when I graduated high school. And I went to college my first year and I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I thought, maybe I should figure out what I don't want to do. So that's what I did for a little while. And then I realized I really loved plants. So what can I do to put myself in a position where that's what I got to do all the time? So I went back to school for plant biology at North Carolina State University, which is what we, used to call botany.
Yeah, fair.
But now it's called plant biology. And, once I got there, I was like, I don't want to wait more than a year to take my first plant-related course. I really want to learn about plants now and dive right in. And I found some courses in the horticulture department for non-majors. It's like, what is this horticulture thing? Had no idea. So I took Intro to Home Horticulture,
That sounds so fun.
Like people who are growing houseplants or like gardening in their backyard. Which is really cool. It's like all the basic fundamentals for like a general audience. And that's what hooked me into horticulture. I was like, okay, this is actually what I want to do. So I decided to double major in horticulture science and plant biology. And I was taking this course with Bryce Lane, who is an Emmy Award-winning TV host, PBS TV host.
Whoa.
His show was called In the Garden with Bryce Lane, little plug. But he's fantastic, and he's very passionate about what he does. And so he would like hook us non-majors into the horticulture department. And one day he came into class, and he had brought this containerized little tree, which I had no idea what it was. And he was like, who knows what Eastern redbud is? And so like all these people raised their hands, and I had no clue because I didn't know trees then. Like when I first went back, I was like, I want to be able to like name the trees in the landscape and in the forest because I don't know who they are. So he brought that in, and I was like, I don't know what that is. But he described it, and he was like, it grows in the understory of the native North American forest on the east side. And they have these vivid, pink, magenta flowers in the spring, which is what you're seeing in the landscape back in like, what is it, May this year? And they just grow in the understory. They're gorgeous. But the really cool thing about this plant and this pot that he had was that it wasn't just an Eastern redbud. It was one that had been developed through breeding and selection by the breeder at NC State. And he had taken this native tree that was, like a regular small tree that had green leaves and grew kind of like spreading upright. And he had turned it into a weeping tree with red leaves.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And so I was like, if he figured out a way to connect people in their garden to the forest and the natural landscape here. So like, say, someone is walking around and they see this really charismatic plant that's like weeping and has like heart-shaped leaves that are red. And they're like, what is that? And they look it up and, because they want to buy it, and they say like, oh, well, this is actually a native North American species. I can go find this in the forest somewhere. And I think it's a really fascinating way to connect people from the landscape that they live in to the landscape that they can go explore in nature. And so that's what really like drew me in, was that kind of possibility to do something like that. And so that's when I was like, I think I want to be a plant breeder, and I want to work with landscape plants. So that's where I am right now. Yeah.
So, when you're talking about this redbud, I think it'd be great if you could elaborate a little bit more on how you go about even breeding new shrub and tree selections. Like, are you just going out into the woods and seeing a plant with a genetic anomaly, or are you taking something back to the lab and working on it? If you could talk about that, that'd be great. And I think it'd be also probably pretty helpful to introduce the topic of varieties versus cultivars.
Okay, so varieties versus cultivars, we'll start there. Variety is something that it's a variation of a species that can be reproduced in nature without any input from humans, right? Whereas a cultivar, if you take that word apart, cultivated, vars, varieties, so cultivated varieties. So that's a variety that has to have input from humans in order to be maintained. So if you think about, some hybrid seeds that you get, little seed packets you get at the garden center to grow in your vegetable garden, in order to get that particular cultivar, like Early Girl, you have to have that particular seed that's been produced by the, the developer. You can't just go collect a tomato in your garden and grow early girl from seed. Or if you think about, the shrubs out in the landscape or the trees out in the landscape that are cultivars, if you collect a seed off of it and you sow that, it's not going to be the same thing. So you need to have a way to propagate the same thing over and over again. And that's a cultivar. So how do we make cultivars, right? So, we can go out into nature. We can go, and that's, where you start. You go out and you collect wild stuff, with permits, of course. You have to go through all the appropriate channels. And you can go out and you can collect wild material with specific traits, whether it's like heat tolerance, cold hardiness, salt tolerance, or like maybe it's just red leaves that are like unique that you haven't seen in that species before. You can bring that back, and then you can use that as a parent. So you can use it to collect pollen off of, or you can use it to put pollen onto and then generate seed. You also can just go out into the nursery industry, garden centers. And that's another place where we start as a breeder to get our plant material or our parents. So you can, one of my first breeding professors, Sean Mellenbacher at Oregon State, said, there's no point in reinventing the wheel, right? That's like one of the first things you learn in breeding. And so anything that's out there for sale right now is basically something that's already been developed. There's been work has been put into it. So why not start with that and then add more stuff to it? The stuff that's out there currently is, for the most part, selected from chance seedlings. So what is a chance seedling? So basically a chance seedling is someone takes a bunch of seed of a species. So let's say they take a bunch of elm seed and then they sow like 1,000 seeds. And then from that 1,000 seeds, because they know a lot about that elm species, they can identify the one tree that has a unique trait. And that's a chance seedling. And then they grow that. And then it's got that unique trait, and then they propagate that particular individual, which is something that we've done at the Morton Arboretum. So most of the cultivars you find in the trade right now that are trees and shrubs have been selected in that way. So we take those plants, we take the wild collected plants, and then we bring them into the greenhouse or into our nursery as a breeder, and then we take pollen from one, and we put it on the flower of another one, and then we combine all these unique traits together until we get a plant that has all of those traits that we're interested in.
That's super cool.
I think it's super interesting to think about that. Some of this work can be done because there's obviously like aesthetic benefits. You wanted to, there's really cool features that you can pull out and can inspire and kind of connect people to things that are similar to what they've seen before, but maybe have this really unique feature. But there's also ways to kind of select around, you briefly mentioned like selecting around different conditions. So like, for survival, that like maybe this is a unique trait that would be really great to have in future populations of this type of tree so that it can more adequately survive in these different types of environments.
Especially, I imagine, urban environments. That's pretty key with space limitations and, as you were talking about, salt tolerance and everything, especially in the where it snows.
Yeah, Chicagoland.
Yeah.
So we also shared a little bit about you and your background with a group of educators and said, if you get the opportunity like we do to sit down with Kim and ask her some questions, what would you ask her? So these next couple of questions are from them. So we'll jump into those right away. And this is a question that either one educator has asked multiple times, but it usually comes up across all of our conversations this season.
Yes.
And it's an exciting one to talk about. So I also don't mind bringing this one forward. But can you talk about some of the perks that are associated with your position or some of the perks of being a plant breeder?
Oh, I have so many perks. I would say first, one of the perks is, I was talking about the fact that we can go out into the wild and collect stuff to breed with, right? I get to go hiking for my job.
That's
right?
super cool.
I get to go in the spring and in the fall and sometimes in the summer and the winter. And, I either go out there I'll go out there to go look for stuff and see how it grows in a native habitat or a natural habitat. I also go hike around the city to see what's growing in the city or what's not growing in the city. So I get to do a lot of hiking and exploring, and I'm very kind of exploratory. I like adventure. So that's one of the major perks. I did a plant exploration trip in 2019 in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, Tennessee. Yeah, it's like one of my favorite places in the world. So if you're into plants, go to the Blue Ridge Mountains, one of the most diverse places in North America and the world for plant life. So I get to do stuff like that. And then another perk, right? So I do that stuff, but I also work with the nursery industry because, if without them, I wouldn't, as a breeder, you're limited by what the nursery industry is willing to grow,
Right.
So I can make whatever plant I want to, and it can be my favorite plant. But if they're like, doesn't really do great for us, or, for people don't want it, then it's not going to go anywhere. So I go to trade shows to network with them and to, develop relationships with them and learn from them. And one of the greatest trade shows for woody plants is in Portland, Oregon in August. Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
So I get to go to Portland, and I get to go to a trade show, and then I get to go hiking and looking at trees in the forest, not to mention I get to work at an arboretum now.
Yeah. And I imagine that tree nurseries are really cool to see too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. What does that look like? What is that like?
It's a giant farm with trees on it instead of corn.
So self-explanatory.
It's crazy. People don't really, I think most people aren't aware of, how a tree gets to their street or to the garden center, to their front yard. And there's a lot of work that goes into that. And it starts at a nursery. A lot of our trees start in Oregon, or they start in the Pacific Northwest. That's where they're first kind of initiated for a lot of the supply chain. And then they are distributed and shipped all over the country and grown and finished by other nurseries. So there's multiple kind of layers of, propagation and growing before a plant gets from start to finish and sold to, a homeowner or a municipal forester or something. So those farms or those nurseries, they can be very, very large scale, multiple farms across, multiple counties or states.
Oh.
Or they can be, just a few, handfuls of acres or something. It just depends on what type of stuff they're growing. And I would say a lot of them are family owned and operated. So a lot of these are small businesses. So really great people to work with too.
Kim, I also know that the Arboretum, as well as, the Chicago Botanic Garden and a number of, other organizations are involved in Chicagoland Grows, and that's included on your profile as well. Can you talk a little bit about how that kind of connects some of your work with plant breeding and what that looks like for kind of our region specifically?
Sure. So Chicagoland Grows is a plant introduction program. It's a brand. That is a partnership between the Morton Arboretum, Chicago Botanic Garden, and the Ornamental Growers Association of Northern Illinois, which is a group of nursery industry folks up here in this region. And how does that connect to my job? Well, I am the woody plant liaison for Chicagoland Grows, so it's part of my job. Like I mentioned earlier, how, as a plant breeder, I could make my favorite plant and it wouldn't matter if the nursery industry won't buy in. So what the Chicagoland Grows brand does is once we're ready to kind of start evaluating a plant for introduction, we've gone through the breeding process or the selection process of chance seedlings, and we've said this plant has some really good qualities about it. We then have to put it through an evaluation process. And ideally, that's what Chicagoland Grows, because our brand says, if it has this brand on it, then it's going to survive Chicago winters. It's going to survive Chicago summers. It may be salt tolerant if it's been developed for, areas that get a lot of salt hit on them, like street trees. And It's probably going to be okay, with an occasional polar vortex. So
anything, really.
Really, like Chicagoland grows plants. If it can grow in Chicago, what I tell people around the country is it could probably grow anywhere. Because Chicago is a pretty difficult place to grow a plant. Things have to be able to tolerate high pH. So, that interaction between water and concrete causes alkalinity in the soil or in the ground. So that's what Chicagoland Grows tells you. So once we decide, okay, this plant could potentially work for that, we send it through this evaluation process with our nursery cooperators. And that takes, 3 to 5 years, anywhere between 3 to 5 years. And then once it goes through that, then we say, okay, now we have to find a bunch of people who are licensed through Chicagoland Grows to actually propagate this plant. So we send them all that. So I, as a woody plant liaison, I send them all that plant material to start propagating it. So if they're grafting, I have to send them material to graft. If they're doing cuttings of stuff, I have to send them the cuttings initially. And then once all that's done, we keep track of who's propagating and then who that first wholesale grower is, and we collect royalties on each plant that is sold. And then we recover some of our investment in the program at the Morton Arboretum through the royalty collections. So that's what Chicagoland Grows does.
So I want to point out that we do have and it's in some of our bonus content from season 2, but we'll link it in the pieces with Kim's episode as well. We have a student and classroom activity around propagation and kind of what that looks like, if that's something that anyone's kind of interested in, just kind of seeing what that looks like and what that process and kind of playing around with it a bit with, I think the activity uses coleus as an example, which is
a fun one.
Correct.
Yeah.
Super fun and super easy, just kind of like begonias, which we've talked about or will talk about in an episode this season too. So, but yeah, definitely that's a resource to check out and to include.
Listening to you talk about your job, it is so interesting because there's so many different components, from hiking in the woods to hiking in the city to, spending time in an arboretum to working with nurseries. And, I know, having an office across the hall from you, I know you have a lab. So it would be great if you could talk about, and I know no day is typical. So maybe if you could share what, if being in the lab, being in the field, what your typical day looks like.
Right. There is no typical day. You're correct, which is kind of what drew me to the career path in the first place. I like having lots of different types of stimulation rather than doing the same thing all the time. But today, let's see, what did I do today? Today, other than coming to do this podcast,
which again, no day's the same.
No day's the same. I'm doing a podcast today. But this morning, I sowed elm seed.
Oh, cool.
So yesterday morning, I collected the elm seed. So I went out to a cemetery yesterday. to go collect seed from a tree that I knew, and that's part of the breeding program. And then I brought it back and had it identified by, confirmed by the curator and our plant records person. We all discussed what is this, and then today I had to sow it. So that's that was this week. And next week, I'll be going to visit one of our nursery cooperators at Kankakee Nursery to go check on some trees that they're growing for us and that they've propagated for us with grafting techniques. So, some days it's coming into the Arboretum and doing work. Some days it's going out to visit nurseries. Other days it's sitting at a computer. Which is also okay sometimes, Yeah.
It seems like a nice variety. I think it is. It was always surprising to me, although it makes sense, that there's actually really unique tree diversity at cemeteries because the trees have been well established there and have been planted for a really long time. But there's witness trees and other accredited arboreta through ArbNet that are actually, they're actually cemetery plots because the trees have been there for a really long time. And sometimes they're planted kind of specially, they're a unique tree that is planted in memory of someone. So they're kind of a unique selection, so to speak. So
yeah. And this cemetery is really cool because, so George Ware was the first director of research at the Morton Arboretum, and he was the first tree breeder at the Morton Arboretum. He was breeding elms. And he also managed this program called the J. Frank Schmidt Trial Pack. So it's like this trial pack that goes around to like all over the country of trees, new trees selections. And so what he did was he said, okay, well, I'm going to plant this trial stuff over here in the cemetery because, it'll be there. Because you know what happens at a cemetery with trees? Nothing. Yeah. Nobody develops a cemetery, right? All that there's nobody bothers the trees there, and you know that they're safe. And so he put those there. But then he also said, I have this collection of elm parents. So he had been collecting wild stuff, like wild seeds were being sent to him from all over the world and from the country. And they had also been creating hybrids. And so he developed all these plants, these trees that had traits that he was interested in, and he wanted to combine them into some, breeding selections. And so he wanted to use them to develop a new cultivar. But he thought, I'm probably not going to be around because trees have a juvenility period. Mm-hmm. So a tree may only take 5 years to mature if it's like something like an ash. Or it might take like 20 plus years to mature if it's like a conifer or perhaps an elm. Mm-hmm. And so he had all of these selections that he had made that he knew they had certain traits that he wanted in a cultivar. And he had them all propagated. And then he planted them all in an isolated location at a cemetery, knowing that the elms everywhere else had died of Dutch elm disease. And said, one day someone will come and they'll be able to collect seed off of these and they'll be able to introduce a new cultivar.
Wow.
And so he started that breeding program in the early 70s is when he started doing that. So the tree that I collected seed off of yesterday was seed that was wild collected in 1979, in July of 1979. Which is before I was born.
Yeah.
Barely, but it was before I was born. And it was collected in 1979 and sent to him from China. And then he grew it, he selected it, and he had it cloned and planted in the cemetery. And I collected seed off of it yesterday.
It's amazing.
Right. And it's 2022, 1979 to 2000. That's like over 40 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's what a cool story.
Yeah, almost 43
dedication
years.
to the future. I mean, that's what's really cool about your position is, you're doing work, again, like George Ware was doing work. He knew he wasn't going to see the results, but he knew he was going to be giving a gift to the future. And that's what you're doing. It's amazing.
Thank you. And thank you to George, for establishing a legacy and putting it in a cemetery where, he knew no roads will be built. So, so that's what's so great about cemetery trees.
So that is such a cool story. I think it's just so interesting to think about and the long game. But I know you get to work with so many different kinds of trees. This is a very hard question that we ask all of our guests, but we are going to make you choose one, and it doesn't have to be a tree, although I would imagine that it probably is. But can you tell us what your favorite plant is?
Such a controversial question. Right? Making me pick a favorite. Okay. I have chosen the Katsura tree.
Great choice. I mean, you can't really go wrong. Like maybe if you said Atlantis, I'd be like, excuse me, what? But no.
That might have some redeeming qualities. Yeah. I don't know, but we'll figure something.
Yeah.
So the reason why I love the Katsura tree, and I actually selected this when I was an undergraduate also in a plant ID class. So the Katsura tree has these heart-shaped leaves, much like the Eastern redbud that I mentioned earlier. Its genus is called Cercitophyllum, which is Cercis-like leaves, which Cercis is the Eastern redbud genus. So you can confuse them in the landscape maybe if you're just looking at the heart-shaped leaf. But the difference between the Katsura and the Eastern redbud is the margins of the leaf are scalloped like a valentine, right? Like a little doily.
So cute.
So that's really cute. And then they're male and female trees. So when they flower, the flowers, you don't think of those if you look at them, you wouldn't think, oh, those are flowers because they don't have petals. Mm-hmm. But the males, they have these like really showy anthers where all the pollen comes from. And then the females have what we call stigma, that female Oregon, that are like this, like really like red pink color, which is pretty cool. And when they get fertilized, they start forming fruit that look like tiny little bananas, which is so cute. Yeah. So tiny little bananas on the females. And then in the fall, when they're starting to shut down, or if there's a drought. So if there's a really bad drought, this summer, like there was last summer, you can notice this too. The trees start dropping their leaves. When they drop their leaves, the sugars that are still in their leaves start to decompose, and it smells like cotton candy.
Such a good tree.
Right? It's such a wonderful tree. And it's it's a low branched tree, so it's easy to climb, which is what we like to do around here. Yeah. Which, I cannot condone climbing at the Morton Arboretum. I'm so sorry. You're not allowed to climb our trees. But, and I don't recommend climbing trees. It's it's not safe. But if you feel like climbing a tree and I'm not, responsible for you, then I recommend it. But yeah, so it's got great climbing branches.
I know that, and I will purposefully change where I walk in the fall just to smell those leaves, because it smells delicious.
It's amazing.
It smells so good. Oh my gosh. Kim, it's just been so great having you here. Again, we've talked about the longevity of your position, the creativity that it requires, it's just like, and talking about Chicagoland Grows, it's such a great example of all these different industries working together for the long-term benefit of people on the planet, which is so amazing. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise today and all of the great work that you do.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure.
This episode of Planted, Finding Your Roots in STEM Careers was made possible by the Morton Arboretum and the Multimedia Services at College of DuPage. Check out additional resources and bonus content at www.mortonarb.org/plantedpodcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and share. This is Jessica Turner-Scoff
and Megan Wiesbrook.
And we hope you'll continue to join us as we journey into STEM careers.